I discovered this area of the riverbeds a couple of weeks ago when I was walking the dogs, and it struck me just how similar it must be to the way the trenches were in the First World War. Well, 100 years ago today, as it's the 1st of July, so 100 years ago, was 1916, was the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. And that day actually was the bloodiest day ever in the history of the British Army. 20,000 men died on that first day of the battle alone. And in fact, over the course of the battle, over 1 million men were either killed or wounded on both sides combined. What a waste. And when you think of wounded, you tend to think, oh well, they're okay afterwards, but when you consider that the medical facilities weren't very good in those days, there was no penicillin, so even if you actually survived a wound, survived having your arm blown off or whatever, there was a very good chance that you'd end up getting an infection and dying of gangrene. We believe that my grandfather was at the Battle of Somme. We can't quite confirm that, but he had quite an interesting early life in that he was born in the 1890s, and his parents, who were both French and living in London, I don't know why they were living there, but they were. They both died within a couple of days of each other, we think in something like a cholera outbreak. So my grandfather went to Dr. Bernardo's home at a very young age and grew up there. And in fact, he ended up lying about his age and joined the army as a drummer boy. Anyway, he went off to India with his regiment and various other places. And in fact, they got back from India in 1914. And then in 1915, his regiment was sent to the trenches. The day leading up to the 1st of July, there was hundreds of thousands of troops all making their way to the front line. It took many of them 8-10 hours just to walk to get to the front line through the trenches, because it was just bottlenecks everywhere. A lot of them didn't even get there till after midnight, and then they stood there waiting for dawn. There was an enormous barrage of artillery fire overnight and into the early hours of the morning, which the stupid generals, all safe back in a chateau miles from the front line, of course, drinking champagne probably and toasting themselves, all thought that there'd be no resistance. So in fact, the first wave that went over the top were told not to run, just to walk to the opposing trenches to take them over, because they didn't think there'd be any opposition. Well, of course they were wrong. They were just mown down, man after man, by machine guns, because the Germans were actually very well dug in, so the artillery barrage hardly touched them at all. And I just can't imagine what it was like, really. I mean, I had a few scary moments in the police force, but nothing compared to, you remember standing here, it's just gone dawn, and you're waiting for the order to go over the top, knowing you're just going to be walking or running or whatever towards machine guns, and there's probably a 90% chance you're not even going to make it. You're about to die. I can't imagine how you'd feel at that moment in time. Anyway, over the course of the next month or so, as I've said, 1 million people were wounded or killed on either side, and for very little achieved. When you think about it, even if they'd achieved their first objectives, they would have been 100 metres or so further along. Big deal. I think the First World War fascinates me because it was just such a ridiculous waste of life. People were just treated as cannon fodder. There was the enemy 300 or 400 metres away for years. What a strange way to run a war. It's totally different to the way the Second World War went. So by the end of the campaign, the battle, call it what you will, there was over 300,000 men killed. That included British, French and Commonwealth troops. America hadn't entered the war at that stage, of course. I think something a lot of people don't realise, at the end of the First World War, they declared that there was going to be an armistice at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, and a lot of generals didn't actually agree with the armistice. They didn't agree with the ceasefire. On that day, on the 11th, knowing that at 11 o'clock the fighting was over, they sent their men over the top, and dozens more were killed on that morning. But to what end? And incredibly, none of them were actually tried as war criminals, because they were, in my opinion, absolutely war criminals. Okay, thank you for watching, and I'm sure next week's topic will be a little more cheerful. But thanks for watching anyway. Bye-bye.